This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today and to be embarking on exploring this important topic with all of you, which is, nature in the Anthropocene. So those are two parts, nature and Anthropocene. Of course, they go together, which we'll talk about. I just got you your syllabus a few hours ago. I don't know if you have had a chance to look at it. I'll go over it before the end of today so that we can have kind of a look at where we're going over the whole class. But just to begin with, I'll tell you that my approach is to kind of go through this explanation and exploration of what the Anthropocene is, what it means to nature and to other living creatures. While we're all part of nature. Kind of from my own investigations as a writer. And the reason I do that is because I think that we're going to be going over science from a number of different disciplines. We have biology, conservation biology, we have earth system science, and geology. And the Anthropocene is such a thing now that all of those things really do go together, but we have to kind of weave them together a little bit, as actually it is pretty broadly understood in the scientific community, I would say, that to confront the challenges that we are confronted with today, we really do need to integrate our ways of investigating what's going on in the world, of what's real. I am a first-time teacher at the Fromm. I teach at the California College of the Arts to design graduate students and to undergraduates. So those are two different kinds of audiences, if you will. And I want to respond to where you are coming from and what you are interested in. So please tell me, as we go along. Some of you will want more science. Some of you will want more philosophy. Some of you will want more history. All of these things come together in the Anthropocene. And I can, where I don't have the knowledge myself, I can get you resources pretty easily because I'm aware of all that. So I'm going to just dive right in right now to my lecture. And you guys can tell me better than I know. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I will give us a break in about 50 minutes. And then depending on how many questions I see as we go, maybe I'll be responding to them as we go. And if I don't, I will respond to them after the break because I'll have a chance to look at them. Okay, so let's get going. I'm going to share my screen. So I am a writer. I mostly write books. I also write for magazines, but I like writing books better because it's just more satisfying. You can go into much more depth. Some of the slides I'm going to show you today are from a book that I wrote and that came out in 2009 called Evidence of Evolution. And you see the writing over here on the right side of the screen is all a little jaggedy. These photos are from the mock-up process of the book. It's not from the final book. So when they're mocking up the text that they're going to use, sometimes, especially on a book that had a big visual element, the type will go in there kind of in a wonky way. And then that gets taken care of at a later date. But I have the PDF of this book from this stage of the game. So this is the title page, Evidence of Evolution, and on the left are beetles. And J.S. Haldane, who was one of the early evolutionary biologists, has a famous saying that one thing we understand about beetles is that God must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles. There are more beetle species on the earth than there are of any other taxa. And these are from the California Academy of Sciences. This tray, by the way, is not how the museum specimens are stored, because they're all different species. This is a tray that is intended to kind of give an overview of different kinds of views of what beetles are. But in the collections, each of these species that you see here would be in their own tray, in their own cabinet. I start at evolution in this class on the Anthropocene, partly because when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by way of natural selection, in many ways, it was just the biggest watershed we've ever had in terms of making empirical knowledge, science, get a lens, get a real foothold in what we know to be true about how life comes into being. Why are we talking about how life comes into being as in terms of the Anthropocene? I'll define that term a little bit later. Because in number one, that's what, you and I are very fundamentally engaged in being alive. And in being alive, we are related to other species. And then also, Darwin really dispelled, not for everyone in the world even today, but he dispelled storytelling as a way of kind of comprehending how life forms came to be and what we're doing here. So why is that important to bring up now? Because the Anthropocene asks us to get even more empirical than Darwin was in understanding what is going on and why it matters and what our human role is. So this is these two illustrations are the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was thought to be most of what we know of as the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution came out of inquiries into time, space, and species through the Bible and through religious studies. So the Garden of Eden, we know that story from the Bible. And we know that God, in the Bible, in Genesis, created Earth in 7 days. And he created a Garden of Eden in which there was no death. And he brought in Adam toward the end. And then Adam was lonely. So God took a rib from Adam and made Eve. And there on the left is the tree of life, the apple tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or sometimes just the tree of knowledge, sometimes of good and evil. And God told Adam and Eve, don't eat that apple from this tree. This is the one thing you can't do here, is eat that apple. If you do, then the Garden of Eden will go away and you will be condemned to death, to mortal life. They were immortal in this timeless, deathless place called the Garden of Eden. So on the right, we know what happened in this story is the snake, is the serpent. This is the devil in bodily form. And this is an interesting thing when we go back to mythologies, which this is one of our major worldwide mythologies, we find really interesting intuitions of how the world really operates, even buried within counter narratives. So the snake, of course, says to Eve, have a bite of this apple, it's so good. Why is God not letting you have it? And her curiosity and her appetite, perhaps, led her to eat the apple. And then, of course, we know what happened. The Garden of Eden disappeared. Adam and Eve were cast out of this no-time paradise into time and into their own mortality. So time, as if there could ever be a place or space that is actually timeless, is a concept that is part of storytelling, because we are embedded in time. The Anthropocene is a geological time unit. It is a category of time. Mortality is what us biological organisms are bound to. We are all going to die. We were all born and we're all going to die. The snake, the world mythologizer Joseph Campbell called the snake an alimentary canal. He said, look what a snake is. All it does is like a big stomach. And, if we're doing research on our gut microbiome or how we eat, we do see that we have this piece of plumbing that goes from our mouth down our esophagus into our stomach and our intestines and our anus that is really like a snake. And Campbell pointed out that this was the deep truth of the story, is that eating is part of being a biological entity, and that eating connects you with life. And when you stop eating, you stop living. Now, Campbell died, I think in the 90s, and I won't go down that rabbit hole, actually. Anybody wants to ask me about Joseph Campbell, I will tell you. So that's the story, right? And from the story comes Noah's Ark. So people are starting to actually ask themselves, what happened to Eden after it was dispersed? Was it dispersed? There were two views. One was that it was dispersed all around the globe. So there were pieces of Eden everywhere. And that what the European devout wanted to do was to bring those pieces all back together again. This is the origin of the botanical garden, by the way. And the botanical garden was initially conceived of during the Age of Exploration as a place where the pieces of the creation would be brought together, and they would create a little simulacrum of the Garden of Eden as God intended it, and that this would be a place to worship the creation. An alternate view was that the Garden of Eden was somewhere around the globe and hidden. And so it had to be gotten and found. Could we go find this Garden of Eden somewhere? Noah's Ark gave people thinking about this a bit of a problem, because they really are going by the Bible to say, how did we come to be? And what's the time scale on which we live? And they start to really think about the implications of Noah's Ark. 2 animals of each species on this ark. Well, first of all, we know that the lions would have eaten the sheep. So how was that going to work? Then we know that if we actually look at the places around the globe where we find animals and plants, we know that they couldn't all get there by boat, right? So it was thought that the Noah's Ark landed in what is today Turkey on Mount Ararat. So if you're starting to understand, as we were in the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Discovery, that there's continents out there separated by large oceans and that there's species on them, you're starting to scratch your head, like, how could a frog in South America get there from Turkey? Because it couldn't swim across the ocean, and it couldn't travel across deserts. Birds, perhaps. Frogs, no. So these started leading the evolutionary thought that brings us to Darwin. There's Mount Ararat. Some people, this is from the internet, some people still believe this, of course. And here's Charles Darwin in his old age. I love this photograph of him. He really worked out his ideas about evolution starting at a very young age, going around the globe on the voyage of the Beagle. And here we go back to the Evidence of Evolution book. This is a specimen from the Academy from the 1905-06 expedition that the Academy sent to the Galapagos. And that's a piece of one of the endemic or local cacti that was brought back. So Darwin, of course, is sailing around the globe with Fitzroy and the Beagle, and he's thinking hard about life. And he's a very reflective person, a naturalist already. He's a young man, and he's observing that when he gets to the Galapagos, that the species on the Galapagos Islands are very close in appearance to species that he sees in Ecuador on the mainland, but they're different. And then as he goes through the islands themselves, he sees that there's differences in these species. There are different species on different islands. And he's wondering, how did this happen? and why. So this he was greatly influenced in his thinking by Charles Lyell, whose principles of geology should perhaps actually have even a bigger place in our cultural history than Darwin does, because Lyell is the person who really worked out that the Earth could not have been made a couple thousand years ago in one fell swoop by a creator. But the evidence of the rocks showed that it had been being made for many, many millions of years and was still in the process of being made in a couple of different ways, largely. So one is we have our land masses that come about from plate tectonics. We didn't know about plate tectonics. Let's scratch that from the transcript. That comes later. What he did understand is that big continental or big land masses come about through volcanic eruptions. So volcanoes from the deep sea erupt, and then as the lava cools, it becomes a landmass. This was how the Galapagos formed. It's how Hawaii formed, the Hawaiian Islands. And then the other ways is that there were these big, and there still are these big land masses that have actually moved around in the oceans and influenced by all kinds of different forces in the weather and in just forces from the deep earth. So he's showing really a long time scale that we're working with now, not 2,000 years. So Darwin is really thinking hard about that. So he really starts to see that there has to be another mechanism by which new life forms come into being. They haven't been invented all at once by God. They have, in fact, evolved or come about through reproduction from ancestors. And he starts to see that life on Earth is a vast genealogy. It is a family tree. Natural selection is the process by which individuals' variation is passed on to the next generation. So those are traits that an organism has that work well in the environment. And because they work well in the environment, the offspring of that species will have a better chance of success on the Earth. Now, one of the things we are seeing here today, which is part of the Anthropocene, is that humanity has figured out a lot of ways to kind of beat out the advantages or disadvantages of traits. So we have a lot of people living on the Earth today that are kept alive by other human beings that would have died out, and their genes would not have gotten passed on even a few hundred years ago. You know, we have decided or not decided, maybe it's unconscious, that every single human life must be sustained. We must try to find ways to sustain it. So we all know children maybe, or people who have passed away who did live, well, you know, like 20, 30 years, who were born with severe birth defects, right? And that they would have died immediately 100 years ago, not very long ago. So we have kind of outsmarted the natural selection process to a certain extent. And that is part of why our population has expanded to this almost, 8 billion and counting that we have now. So Darwin proposed that over many generations, natural selection causes the characteristics of populations to change. And evolution is a change in the characteristics of a population from one generation to the next. So going back to the California Academy of Sciences and other natural history museums, that's what all those specimens are there for. They're there for figuring out, where did this body type that we find come from? What came before it? And where did we find it? Because we're trying to actually create a gigantic spreadsheet of this genealogy of life on Earth. How does life work? It actually works through reproduction. It also works through eating. And we're talking life. I will come back to this mountain lion and to the role of the top predator in ecosystems. We humans are arguably the top predator now, having outwitted basically mountain lions, grizzly bears, and wolves by being able to shoot them instead of worrying about avoiding them. And the only kind of predator perhaps that we have challenging us today on a really serious level is fire. Fire is also a great consumer. It is an eater of anything. So, and I'll talk more about fire as we go along. It's very relevant to all of us here in California. So this is Darwin's process again. May the best beak win. These are some finches from one of the Galapagos Islands, and Darwin didn't collect finches when he collected some finches, but his thinking about natural selection came about through mocking thrushes or mocking birds that there's several different species of in the Galapagos Islands. And he saw that different mocking thrushes on different islands had different beak morphology, and morphology is the physical characteristics. Years later, it was other scientists. So Darwin comes out with this theory, on the origin of species, and it is a big game changer. There's a lot of, hoopla and conflict in science over his assertions. But one thing that happened is that then scientists all over the world started to say, well, let's prove it. So Darwin made a very, very detailed argument, and that's one of the reasons why it holds up so well. That book is really fat, very, very detailed observations. But by the standards of today of quantifying change, it's storytelling still. Now, his storytelling has been substantiated by quantitative or mathematical underpinnings that scientists for the 150 years since he published that have been working out. And so the finches, these are all of the finch species from the Galapagos, became kind of the poster child of the Galapagos speciation idea, basically from other scientists, most notably David Lack. And the phrase Darwin's finches is something that David Lack coined. David Lack figured this stuff out very scientifically in the 1940s. And he basically was very aided in his own work by the specimens of finches at the California Academy of Sciences. So a piece of history here is that the California Academy of Sciences is founded in the late 1800s. And part of what's going on is that San Francisco has become a major city. The people who live in San Francisco want it to be kind of on the map as a major American city, number one. Number two, California turns out to have a unique flora and fauna that is unknown, more or less, to the East Coast institutions like like Harvard and the Smithsonian. They have some specimens from California, but the scientists or the nascent scientists in California are understanding, wow, we have a treasure trove here. So in 1905 and 06, though, the Academy sends an expedition to the Galapagos. This is an illustration, I think this is from David Lack, of different beaks. And so the different beaks have different purposes. Because they're adapted to the vegetation on different islands. So some islands have vegetation which has food sources for birds most abundantly in the form of seeds. Those birds have to crack open seeds. They need like pliers. Narrow beaks need to pluck insects. So there's some islands where the finches are more adapted to using insects as their food. And then the other kinds of beaks, that's an example of these beak forms. These are some visualizations from the 05-06 expedition that the Academy sent out to the Galapagos. And this person up here on the right here is Rollo Beck. Rollo Beck, who's also down here on the right, he was the leader of the expedition. He's an extraordinary character, a swashbuckler, unformally educated, an ornithologist by passion. but he also really loved to shoot birds, and he was very famous for being able to shoot them in great numbers. And then in the middle inset here is one of his expedition diary pages. The Academy, and I will give you a link to this, I'm making a note of it. Academy Expedition link. The Academy has an incredible archive of photographs and other data points from this expedition. But the reason why the Academy did this, basically sent out this expensive expedition, is because of it was taking advantage of our position here in San Francisco on the Pacific Ocean. Darwin was the biggest thing that happened in natural history ever. But to send an expedition to the Galapagos from England, which was done many, many times, meant sailing all the way around South America. Because remember, the Panama Canal doesn't come till much later. But we could go there very directly. So the Academy's identity was very much focused on, we will be the major holders of specimens from the Galapagos Islands, the cradle of natural selection. And it still is today, really. We have the biggest holdings. Now, another couple of important people during this time period are Henry Walter Bates and then, oops, where's my Wallace? We'll get to Wallace. So Bates was a big specimen collector. And so, you know, Darwin was from a wealthy family. He was a gentleman naturalist, but there were people making a living going out to faraway places and bringing back specimens for collectors and for museums in what was starting to become known as this much bigger world, much more diverse world. And Henry Walter Bates was one of them. He made the most beautiful field notes. And so these are a couple pages of his drawings and notes of what he found. And this is where we start to deepen our sense of what's going on out there in evolution and natural selection. So what Bates made the important discovery of is that some species look the same as another species, but they're different. So before Darwin and before Bates, whatever you looked like, your morphology was what you were as a species. And sometimes that's called phenology. Pheno means to show in Greek. So the physical characteristics that an organism shows were how science identified what that was. And Bates noticed that some species looked exactly like another species, but they were actually different species. And so what he discovered, and this is rife in the butterfly world, was what's called Batesian mimicry, where one butterfly is poisonous to birds, another butterfly is not poisonous to birds, but it pretends to be, basically. It looks like it's poisonous so that birds will not eat it. Or that's why we think they do it. We really have never asked, or if we've ever asked a butterfly, it has never answered. So this is getting a little complicated, right? That not everything you see is the deep reality of what it is, and that there's behaviors and ecology and relationships that are also going on to comprise what a species is comprised of. Here is an Inachus butterfly that is mimicking a leaf. And so it's an adaptation that this particular butterfly, when it closes up its wings, it looks like a dead leaf. That has probably allowed it to survive better because predators don't recognize it. And this is very rife in the insect kingdom of looking like something that you're not. What is that trying to look like? A spaceship. So we just, I don't know, maybe when spaceships are made, we will say, well, we know where they got that idea from. Here's Wallace. So Wallace was famously the other person who came up with the idea of natural selection as the mechanism for evolution, pretty much at the same time Darwin did. Sometimes there's challenges to Darwin that Wallace, who was not wealthy and who was not well connected, that Darwin cheated Wallace out of his due, but he really didn't cheat Wallace out of his due. Wallace wrote a short paper about his idea, but Darwin wrote a gigantic book substantiating his ideas. And when Darwin found out about Wallace's paper, when he presented his own findings to the, I'm having a moment of the big scientific, I'm just forgetting the name of it, in England, when he presented his findings, maybe to the Royal Society, he co-presented with Wallace. He was very generous to Wallace, in fact. He didn't try to suppress this other person coming up with the same kind of idea at all. But Wallace has a whole other level of importance to us that is really equal to the idea of evolution and natural selection today, especially in the context of the Anthropocene. So he was a person who was not wealthy, and he made a living going around the world collecting specimens and bringing them back to England and selling them. He sold a lot to English institutions and individuals, and also to European institutions and individuals. And today, actually, there was an exhibit at a museum in Berlin a few years ago of natural history specimens from the Berlin Museum of Natural History. Virtually all of those specimens of butterflies, for example, were collected by Wallace, and they were collected from what we call the Global South today. So this was the purpose of making this statement at this Berlin exhibit, was to point out the imperial and colonial underpinnings of natural history museums. And your imperial and colonial concepts, that's what's going on here, and that's how history has been made, and that it's deeply unjust and destructive, is part of our conversation about what the Anthropocene is. So we need to just put a little placeholder in our thinking, because we'll come back to this, about the colonial nature of this part of science, this huge part of science, which revolutionized how we understand nature. If it has if it is made by colonial forces, is it legitimate? How can we reconcile it with other ways of knowing? And we will talk about other ways of knowing later in this semester or term. So one thing that Wallace was a great naturalist. He noticed that he divided the globe into major ecoregions, basically. And he noticed that there were different kinds of plants and animals in different places on the earth. In a more specific way, in a place-based way. So Darwin is noticing the Galapagos, he's going around the globe, but he's not really trying to make a comprehensive statement about what kinds of species we see where, although he did do that as well, but not to the same degree. So what we get from Wallace is this idea of biogeography, bio meaning life and geography meaning the land and the landscape. This is a more contemporary visualization of those regions, but they're pretty much what he said. They've been refined. So we have different the Palearctic is over there on the Europe and Asiatic side, and we are the Nearctic. We're the new age. Another important concept coming up soon upon the heels of all this is the niche, the environmental niche. This is a nest from the Galapagos, from the Academy's collections, and the word nest is from the French. The word niche is from the word in French meaning nest, and niche describes your home in the world. It's your place in the world. It's who you eat and who eats you. Are you a primary producer like a plant? Are you an herbivore like an insect or a cow? Are you a carnivore like a wolf or a grizzly bear. And then where do you live? What is the temperature and precipitation? Those are two main drivers, temperature and precipitation, about what makes a place home for a specific species. And in the case of the finch nest, they're tiny. They're like that big. The finch lays the eggs in this nest. The nest is comprised of vegetation from the island. So all of the finch nests from the different Galapagos Islands look differently because they're made from different plant materials. The eggs are not ready to hatch yet, and they incubate partly in the nest. So just think about that for a minute, that from the actual natural environment of plant life is like a womb for the life that will come forth from the egg, laid by a bird that has had an active sexual reproduction, but within a deep entwinement with the environment. And this concept really got refined by Joseph Grinnell, who founded the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology over at Berkeley. Here's Grinnell out in the field, and then on the right is one of, this is a piece of data from the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, a photograph and a description of what we're looking at. And this, again, so this biogeography, who lives where, what are the features of different places around the globe in terms of temperature, precipitation, altitude, and then various things that come along with that too. As you probably all know, here in California, we're one of 5 Mediterranean ecosystems in the globe. So there's further refinements of what kind of ecosystem we live in. Then this idea of the niche. This is a very important concept right now in the Anthropocene, because one of the things that's happening is that this niche, this area of intertwined physical materials with climate, is changing very quickly for species. And so they are losing their niche. Some are able to adapt and some are not able to adapt. Humans, we are good. I mean, sometimes people call the Anthropocene the result of human niche construction. So I'm sitting, in a flat in San Francisco, and I'm in a house, right? Like, I'm protected from the environment. It doesn't really matter. I need a sweater or I don't need a sweater, but that's about the level of variation that I really have to worry about in terms of temperature. I'm thirsty. I just turn on the tap and I get some water. I have my filtered water. I get hungry. I have food in the refrigerator. We have constructed a place for ourselves on this earth, made out of the materials of the earth, that is global. It's not just one little place. I can be in a house in Japan and similarly be protected from the elements and similarly get some food out of a refrigerator. Of course, that is not the same everywhere in the world, where some people don't have places to live. Down the street on Union Street, people don't have places to live. And they're creating a niche out of doorways. And that is one way to think about the Anthropocene as we go along. One of the most amazing things is that Grinnell was like the world's best observer. If you ever get a chance to go over to the Grinnell Library, which is in the building, the Natural Sciences building at Berkeley, which has the library in it, there's a room in that library full of Grinnell's field notes, and they are just fantastically detailed. They're so detailed that I think it was 2008, a team from Berkeley and from other institutions in California resurveyed Grinnell's survey. Grinnell understood in 1910 that what he saw, what he was observing, was going to change and was already changing drastically due to human impacts. So in 1910, he said, I am going to get a snapshot as close to reality as I can of what is where in these locations in California selected for having different types of ecosystems. And his work is so detailed that the researchers in the late 2008, 9, 10 able to go out and read his notebook and find exactly the stream, exactly the tree, exactly the angle that he looked at when he took note of a warbler. And that has allowed us to actually have this frame of change over time in California, because things have changed from 1910 to now in some very significant ways. It's a complicated story. The birds have responded differently than the amphibians to climate change, essentially, and to also not only just climate change, but to habitat change, because around these places, the ground itself has been changed. We have, industrial agriculture in the center of the state that we never had. We've dammed rivers, and which we never had. We have big cities around these places that we never had. These have impacted the terrain for these other species. This is an illustration by a designer who likes to focus on natural history, and she has made a nice illustration of Grinnell. What I love about Grinnell is that he made these beautiful things, right? Like this map, Death Valley National Monument map, and his pages of his writing are very beautiful. He was very fastidious. And when you read them, when you look into them, you get back into this time. You can almost see through Grinnell's eyes. This, I think, is a utility of art. And science and art, oh, they're two different things. Well, maybe not. Close observation yields a lot to us, especially through the physicality of someone's drawing. Somehow someone drawing something, someone writing something has an immediacy, a different kind of immediacy, in my opinion, than a photograph. So back to evolution. When I was writing this book in 2008, 7 and 8, this is really a turning point for me and my career, because I was already an environmental journalist, trying to write things on behalf of nature. But when I interviewed all the scientists over at the Academy, one after another of them told me we're going through a 6th mass extinction of plants and animals. And, it didn't really register to me for a while, but really every single one of them said it. And after a while, I got it. Like, what do you mean a mass extinction? What does that mean? Were they just being dramatic about, development of humans, human development? What were they talking about? And when I finally kind of got it, I was like, well, I have to tell people what is happening here. So you all know about the 6th extinction of plants and animals that is going on now, maybe because of Elizabeth Kolbert's book, what was it called? 6th Extinction, which came out in 2014. So remember that I'm writing this in 2007 and 8. And so I hadn't heard the phrase, and I didn't understand. It was in that time period, actually, since I had my awakening to 2014, when Elizabeth Kolbert published her book, the whole concept got a lot broader dissemination to the public. Now, extinctions are one of the very major ways that we divide one era or epoch from another. So the Jurassic is marked by the extinction of dinosaurs and of most of a large quantity and diversity of animal life and plant life on the globe. And we know that the Jurassic came about because of a meteor strike, which took, that wasn't until the 1950s, I think, that we understood that that's what happened there. So today it's the same thing, where we're looking in the fossil record and seeing that there was an abundance of animal remains and plant remains to a certain point in the fossil record, and then the species composition changes dramatically at a certain point So below a point, there's a lot of dinosaur bones, and above it, there's none, virtually. Unless, of course, we do count birds because they are dinosaurs. So the same thing is happening now, is that we can see in the fossil record this vast reduction in the number of plant remains and animal remains. Now, some species do squeak through as themselves, and others, adaptations of those species, come through and are able to adapt to the new conditions that are coming about. So this is an ammonite fossil on the left, and then a chambered nautilus on the right. The ammonite is extinct, went extinct many millions of years ago. The chambered nautilus has been around for millions of years and is still around. So those are animals that built their shell around the body of themselves. The shell is a protective layer to protect against being eaten. Now, what happens in Earth history is that predators with sharp teeth and jaws start to evolve and crack those shells to get at the animal within them. And then over millions of years, there's an evolution of form where different reproductive events, the genes are passed on for this phenotypical, or what shows change in this relationship of this hard shell. So that was an ammonite and a chambered nautilus. Related to those species are the cuttlefish on the left, the octopus in the middle, and the squid on the right. So these are species that traded out the external hard shell. They took that piece of their body and they internalized it. And they put their soft parts on the outside. So the cuttlefish, this is just the bone of the cuttlefish, not the body. But you know that octopus and squid move quickly, and they think the octopus changes color faster than the human eye can discern. So they're trading out one strategy for survival for another, but they're still related to those other species. The beaver, we will come back to. This is an ecosystem engineer. And the beaver is something that is very, not only the beaver, but other species that are real ecosystem engineers. What they do changes the way water works through the system. They actually change the geology of where they live and around where they live by what they do. And this is an important concept and an important part of the Anthropocene, because the way beaver did it or do it is beneficial to other species. Quite often, the way humans do the same thing, which is create dams and build things and move wood around, quite often the way we do it is not beneficial to other species. And this is a kiwi. Birds, flightless birds evolved on islands because they didn't have to fly off of the island to get enough food. And most of them have gone extinct because when new predators have been introduced to those islands, they don't have good strategies for getting away from them. It's one of the things that happened to the dodo and that kiwi. So here's some extinction. Extinction is a natural process. If we didn't have some life forms going off the tree of life, we would have no room for new ones. And the environment is always changing to a certain degree. So this is the flightless cormorant. One of them is flightless, the other one is not flightless. The flightless cormorant went extinct. And this is a light-footed clapper rail. It's endangered, but it has actually bounded back in some places thanks to restoration projects. Restoration we will talk about. It's a very important strategy for dealing with the Anthropocene. And this is an elephant shrew. Despite that name, it is not related to elephants. It's a mammal, and this is a new species of mammal that was discovered something like 10 years ago. So most mammals never say never, but most of them have been discovered. Most birds have been discovered. Millions of insect species have not been named. I'm saying the word discover kind of interchangeably with named to science. And then this is a horseshoe crab. The horseshoe crab is a very ancient creature that has been around for millions and millions of years. The horseshoe crab has a substance that it does something. Now I'm forgetting exactly what. It does something to keep vaccines viable. And we were using that substance from horseshoe crabs to keep vaccines viable until COVID. And right, one of the things that came along with COVID was a fantastic breakthrough in making a synthetic copy of what the horseshoe crab has, which is a good thing, because otherwise we would have probably, they're already under a lot of threat from many different angles, but we would have probably lost them all due to keeping all those millions and millions of vaccines viable. And this is a little bit more extinction. On the right-hand side are Carolina parakeets, which were overhunted in the great southeastern forests of the United States. It's almost inconceivable that they would be gone because they existed in such huge numbers. But this is a thing about population biology, something that is part of conservation biology, and we'll talk about it in more depth, that some species are dependent on being part of big numbers. And Carolina parakeets were one of them. So when you got rid of these big flocks, it was not possible for just a few to carry on because they couldn't really live without being part of big numbers. On the left is an extinct plant. I think that's, I'm not sure where that is from. And then on the right is the extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. And this is a very gigantic bird. That specimen is about as tall as I am, 5'4". And people have persisted back to storytelling in saying that they've seen one in the forests of the East Coast again. And it's possible that someone has uncovered an ivory-billed woodpecker. I will send a link to that article too. But a rule of thumb is the bigger the animal, the bigger the territory it needs. And the East Coast was completely deforested, not completely, but almost completely deforested several times, from the 1700s on, and been pretty recent to like the early 1900s that we realized we can't just cut all the forests down. And so they went extinct when they lost the forest. And then we have here the Xerxes blue butterfly, which I'll tell you about, and then the passenger pigeon on the right. So my alarm has gone off to give you a 10-minute break, and I will see you back here. It is 1:54. How about 2:05? 9-minute break. Okay, 2:04. I have two really good questions here in the chat. 3 good questions. Where does Alexander von Humboldt fit into all this? So Humboldt is a great person to bring up. Humboldt, his one of his big works came out in 1790. So we're talking, a different generation, the generation before Darwin. Darwin was totally motivated and adored Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt, what a character. Actually, I'll put a link to that great book by Andrea Wolf, The Invention of Nature, which is a biography of Humboldt in your resources for this week. But so Humboldt went around the globe, and he, really the age of exploration. He made very minute and very directed measurements of altitudes. He intuited this idea of life zones, that at different altitudes, there's different kinds of life forms that are adapted to those climates those ideas were cohered by him in a written manner. There's certainly other people that had those ideas before him. In a way, and Humboldt did believe in the interconnectedness of all things. He trained his mind on that. The way that he wrote was inclined toward that. And in a way, we could say that Humboldt was an ecologist primarily, and then Darwin comes along and is really focused on evolution. Now, those two things, aren't they part of the same thing? Yes, ecology and evolution. But really, since professional science developed partly in response to Darwin and partly in response to just an increasingly industrialized world and an increasingly administrated world, ecology and evolution have been studied separately as separate things. It's been a problem. Actually, the Anthropocene is bringing those two things back together again in a big way. We can't really talk about ecology without talking about evolution and vice versa. And it's still hard to kind of describe the intersection of those two, because there's not that much science that's done out there that really looks at things that way, because there's such complexities to ecology and there's such complexities to taxonomy and evolution that in order to be really quantifiable about what you are saying, to sort of advance the science, you really have to bring it down, bring your question down to something very specific. But today, where we're wondering, here in California, are plants, what's the best approach to protecting plants and plant life from climate change? Some evolutionary biologists will say, leave them alone. Don't do anything. Allow the plants that survive wildfires, allow the plants that come to environments that have been degraded by humans, allow the survivors to just survive, because the survivors will pass on resilient genes to the next generation. Other people are saying, let's move species. Let's take the Joshua trees, maybe not able to live in Joshua Tree National Park anymore. So let's move them to a cooler climate so that we don't lose them. Now that is interfering directly with evolution and ecology. So this is very much an active dilemma that we have, and we haven't learned enough about how plants and animals are responding to all of the pressures of what they're dealing with now. Is there any evidence of insect evolution to perhaps take advantage of air pollution or developments that are generally thought to be destructive to the environment? Well, that's a really interesting question. There's a really famous example of how species respond to environments that occurred in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You will remember that I think it's early 1900s, just gigantic smog from coal-fired plants that were fueling the steel industry, perhaps, just incredible pollution and smog in in Pittsburgh, so that it was like, night during the day, because there was so much particulate matter in the air. This moth that was white actually changed its morphology, its phenology during that time period to be dark. It became the survivors, the generation came along and was going to survive better if they didn't stand out as white objects in this darkness. So they became dark, which made them harder to see to predators. Then when the air quality was improved in Pittsburgh, the morphology of those insects changed back to white, more white. So some insects reproduce a lot, and they can pass on their genes very quickly. So when we talk about fruit flies, for example, that's why, or Drosophila as a study subject in labs, partly is because you can go through, hundreds of generations in a short period of time and really track genetic change. But remember, birds don't reproduce that often. Humans don't reproduce that often. The bigger the bodied animal, the slower usually the gestation cycle is. So it just takes, this is the thing, like elephants. How can elephants adapt to changes that are happening in decades when their life cycle goes over many, many decades? So yeah, there's a lot of evidence of, and insects it's easier to see, of adaptations that are able to be passed on to have relative success in environments that have been changed by human impacts. And then a question about, how does philosophy fit into the study of the Anthropocene? How in the world could colonialism have anything to do with whether a fact is legitimate or not? I think that's a really good question. I'm going to put a placeholder in it, because putting together kind of colonialism as a concept and then whether a fact is true are kind of putting different scales together. In other words, colonialism is a subject on a large scale in the context of what I'm talking about, and then a fact is on a very specific scale. So when people are challenging facts, they're not necessarily challenging the fact. They're challenging the context in which that fact is placed and understood. So it's a cultural thing. We understand different facts differently depending on our cultural disposition. But we'll dive into that a little bit more with a little bit more care and a little bit more specifically farther into the term. All right, I'm going to now share my screen again. If I can find my cursor, there we go. All right, now we come to some slides that are about geology and this idea of the Anthropocene as a geological time unit. And I like to just draw your attention to thinking about how we visualize what we understand, and how we help ourselves understand concepts by the way we visualize them. And then also maybe by the way we limit our understanding by the way we can possibly picture them. Because the Anthropocene is something that's actually kind of hard to picture. And I didn't put any slides of this in today, but I will, of some artists' renderings of Anthropocene environments. And in general, Anthropocene environments are portrayed as places of utter devastation, just tremendously polluted areas of, mountaintop mining, devastation of gigantic natural areas. But I would say that another Anthropocene environment is a shopping mall. I mean, that looks pleasant to us, right? But it's another scene of what's going on here, of how we trade goods, how we have transportation to the goods that we consume, and to the globalization of the marketplace. That's really an Anthropocene environment. So Anthropocene, maybe we want it to not always be a scene of devastation. But here's a geological time scale illustration by an artist, Ray Troll, who's done a number of these. I think they're very inviting. I ask you to think about what you think about it, though. So here he's shown that each of these eras or scenes is associated with a layer in the geology. And in his this one, here's another one from Roy Troll, showing it in a little bit of a different way, illustrating the top of the heap here, the Anthropocene perhaps, as with a truck, with a person, in this kind of whimsical way. But then he's also showing here big extinction right here, gigantic extinction right here, and 2.5 billion years down here. Earth forms 4.6 billion years ago. This one is another illustration showing the same progression of eras and then giving kind of more illustrations on the side of what the Earth might have looked like. We don't exactly know. And then what we do know, it does look like pretty much up here in the suburbs. And this illustrator has taken this, like, made this whole cutout of the Earth as a kind of little illustrative way of saying this is a core of the Earth going down to the beginning of time. Here are the layers. So I just ask you to think about which ones communicate more to you, which do you respond to, which makes more sense to you. Here's one that's very straightforward, no real illustrative embellishments. Sometimes it's easier to just see words. It makes it very clear where the extinction events are, and then what the time periods are on the right. So what we're talking about with the Anthropocene is a proposal that the Holocene, which is the era that we live in now, which we've been in for about 10, 11,000 years since the retreat of the last ice age, is that the Earth conditions that have allowed the Holocene to be what we live in are changing and have changed in a way that is discernible in the fossil record. It has to be, it's not a philosophy, it's a geological fact determined by geologists, but not without contention. So we'll talk about that contention. Here's another way of visualizing time and these eras, like, and giving the sense of time going around, which it essentially does, right? Because the way that we live, the way we experience time is through the seasons and the days and our lifespan. And we can imagine, life before us and life after us, but it's in a sequence of cycles around the sun. This is a very important part of understanding the Anthropocene, kind of coming back down to the very basic fact that the Earth is revolving around the sun and that all life on Earth is powered by the sun. And we cannot live without the sun and the products of photosynthesis that the sun makes possible. So we're going around here as if by cycles of days and eras in this visualization. And then someone has put this here, a visual representation of the breakdown of geological time. The Anthropocene would come after the Holocene. So this person has added to that visualization this very dramatic, oh, stop time. I show you this to point out that there's no such thing as a breakdown of geological time. There's no such thing as that. Geological time marches on, whatever is living on this earth or not. Remember, the geological system is the rocks and the water and the atmosphere, and life was the latecomer to that. And I'll go over that more carefully in subsequent classes. But there's a couple of things that get said about the Anthropocene that are really missing the point. And this is one of them. There's no such thing as a break in the geological time. So the Anthropocene word, where did that come from? Paul Crutzen won the Nobel Prize for his work on the ozone layer. And famously in, I think it was 2008, at a scientific meeting, maybe it was earlier than that, the geophysicists and all of these hard science people are discussing the year's events and what new discoveries have come about. And people are talking about the Holocene this and the Holocene that. And he just says, stop talking about the Holocene. Every single thing that you are saying that has occurred in the Holocene is indicating that we don't live in the Holocene anymore. We live in the Anthropocene. And then everybody just stopped. At this conference, the word had been used before by Eugene Sturmer, and I forget Eugene Sturmer's bona fides, but this Crutzen had a lot of cultural cachet. It was a person that everybody really respected, And when he said that, and he pointed out that all of the reports that these people were making about the Holocene pointed to massive perturbations in the Earth system, they all saw the sense of that. And so he really started this discussion. I'm going to come back to this data a couple of times in our term. And I just want to kind of give you just like a visceral sense of what Crutzen was talking about. Since the 1950s, all of these markers of things going on have made the same leap. World population, gross domestic product, foreign direct investment, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane. I won't read them all, but we go down to transportation, telecommunications, international tourism, tropical forest loss. What we see is an acceleration of use of the world's biosphere, the products of the biosphere, and an increase in chemicals and other results of the way that we use it. It's just astonishing to think. I'm turning 63 next month. I was born in 1959. I've always considered, that I live a normal life, that I'm living a normal lifespan, but it has not been a normal lifespan that I have lived in. It has been the most abnormal lifespan ever, perhaps. The change in the cycling of materials, of atmospheric gases, of pollutants, of food production, of population, all has been extraordinary since the 1950s. So this is having impacts on how the Earth system works. Now, here's just a good one, I think. Although I can't really explain to you what this formula means. Earth has exited the interglacial envelope. So here's the interglacial, here's the Holocene. And when we're talking in interglacial and glacial, we're talking the temperature, basically, and the amount of precipitation in what forms that we're measuring Earth systems by. So the Earth system, industrial societies, astronomical forcings. I don't know what that means. Geophysical forcings, I do know what that means, and internal dynamics. So internal dynamics is going to be like volcanoes or responses when we move gigantic amounts of sand, for example, from a harbor. We are not only changing the geophysical ways that water and that land interact, but we are also, in some cases, provoking other kinds of responses from the way that the geology works. So these are technical things. We'll look at a few of those things specifically to understand them better through the term. But this is where we're at, where the way the Earth system functions is now different than it was before the 1950s, which is extraordinary. Now, Earth system, what do we mean by that? One of the things, and this is an important part of this whole concept of the Anthropocene and of the class, when people understood that CO2 levels were going up, the famous Keeling curve in Mauna Loa, one of the questions scientists had was, okay, what's that going to do to plant life? What's that going to do to other biotic life? What's it going to do to the weather system? And what happened at that time is that people who are working in their separate fields began to understand, oh no, we have got to create a synthetic coming together of how we understand how the Earth works. So what we call Earth system science has come into being, and it's a profound event. It's like evolutionary biology with Darwin comes into being in 1859. Well, Earth system science comes into being, and I don't know what year we want to put it at, the 80s, 1980s, because science are understanding you can't change the atmosphere so much without it having impacts on everything else. And so this is really the essence of Earth system science, is that there are 4 spheres that create what we think of as the Earth: the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. So now let's understand this kind of going back chronologically to that beginning of the Earth, right? When the Earth begins, it has geosphere, it has rocks, and it has water, which help create an atmosphere. But it took a long time for those 3 spheres to be joined by a 4th sphere, which is biological life. That's us, that's plants, that's animals, it's biology. Now, you and I mostly go through our days as if we're just, well, we care about the weather because it's hot or cold out. We care about the rain because we want our gardens to grow, and we understand we need we need to renew our aquifers. We care about the geosphere in terms of, well, I want to go hiking on Mount Tam this weekend, and that's a geological feature, and I'm worried about an earthquake, and that's another geological feature. But we tend to behave as though the biosphere, biological life, exists all on its own. But it does not. It is dependent entirely on the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. And the way that the biosphere operates, in turn, impacts the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. So we understand that with the atmosphere, right? Because we understand we're burning fossil fuels, so we're changing the atmosphere. We understand that changing the atmosphere changes the hydrosphere, or the way that water moves through the Earth, because we're going to have more rain in some places, higher sea level rain in some places, and bigger droughts in some places, because the hydrosphere is intimately twined with the atmosphere. Well, the geosphere is also intimately twined with all of the above. And we are impacting the geosphere, partly because we are directly altering it with dams, with moving gigantic amounts of rock, cement. Think of Dubai. Think we made an island, a city island. That was not made out of nothing. That was made out of sand, that was made into concrete, that was made out of steel, that was, mined from the earth. We are taking out of the geosphere material as it exists in one form, and we're creating it into another form. And that other form is changing the way that these other parts interact. I think it's very hard to understand this 4 spheres very intuitively. And I think that's kind of our quest, is to try to understand it a little bit more deeply, looking at it from all different perspectives so that we can see kind of what makes sense. Where are the intersections that make the most sense to us? Some of you may have heard of the Gaia hypothesis. So James Lovelock, an important scientist who died just last month, he made a name for himself also with work on the ozone layer. But then he wrote a book called the Gaia, in which he proposed initially that the Earth is a self-sustaining system of homeostasis. So homeo means the same, and stasis means still. So that things remained in a still kind of balance, because the way that the Earth functioned was if it became too much here, it would be compensated for here. Things got to be too cold here, some warm would come here, too wet, too dry, whatever. That hypothesis was a very important beginning synthesis of Earth system science. The thing that was wrong about it is that the Earth is not creating a homeostasis to make life nice for humans or other biotic beings that we value, certain kinds of vegetation and animals. He revised the Gaia hypothesis, and he worked with Lynn Margulis, who she was a microbiologist who made her own mark in science. They were kind of an odd couple of scientists to do this together, but they did. And they revised Gaia to more carefully say, Gaia is about the interaction between these spheres. There's no taking the geology out, there's no taking the water out, there's no taking the atmosphere out, and there's no taking the biology out. The way he says it here, evolution is a tightly coupled dance with life and the material environment as partners. From the dance emerges the entity Gaia. But people often misunderstand Gaia to mean everything's going to be okay because the Earth Mother will take care of it. And it depends what your perspective is. I think if you're a piece of molten lead at the center of the Earth, it's probably going to be okay for you. If you're anybody else, no. It's more like this. This is I'm just showing you this illustration to just give you a sense of the cycling of between these different spheres. It's too hard to really grok this. You can look at this later if you want, when you have the slide presentation sent to you, to get a sense of, when, just to take one thing out of here, over on the left, you have plant biomass with this arrow going down into the soil carbon. So the soil carbon is now enriched because of the actions of the plant, and it is then performing these other functions as a result. When we use fossil fuels, make cement, and put land use changes, we change the way this cycle is going. And this also happens over there in the aquatic realm. Basically, this is Earth system science: air, water, land, and life. Fire has a unique role in uniting all of these, and we'll talk about that. But for now, I will stop there. What time is it? Oh, and ask for your questions or comments. One thing I'd like to know as we go forward in the term is, what you're particularly interested in. I am particularly interested in biodiversity, and also in having us have a better understanding that it is a material world that we live in, and that what we do is physical. So a lot of the Anthropocene discussions, and I will share those with you, are philosophical, or they're from cultural critiques of how we live. And I think all of those are interesting. I'm always interested to read about them, but I kind of don't think they're as important as understanding physically how we live, what we consume, how we consume it, how we change land use, and how, if we wanted to be Anthropocene activists, we want to really be activists about land use change. Here's a question: what do you think of the fact that the universe is so huge and varied and we are just a tiny portion of it? You know what? Here is the truth about me. I don't think about that at all. I don't think about it at all. I have arguments with my husband, who's a big believer, like in extraterrestrials, that there's got to be extraterrestrial life. And you know what? I just say, I have at it. You can think about that. You can investigate that. NASA, all the people investigating that, go for it. I am really interested in how we are living on this earth now. I think it matters. The word matter means, physical. And I am interested in working to better understand how we can allow the beautiful physical world that we live in to continue in something like the form that you and I enjoy. And it's just that I mean, it is interesting, the universe. I just don't have enough time to investigate the universe as well. How deep and high has life in any form been detected? Well, that's a good question. It's been detected very deep in very deep ocean vents. We have thought for a long time that life had to have at least some kind of photosynthetic ability, that photosynthesis would have to go on to create food for the organism. And I believe that there's been organisms that have been uncovered in these deep sea vents that don't photosynthesize. And I believe they contain something called cyanobacteria, which is another chemical compound that they are able to continue their life form with using that. I don't know how high it has been detected. That would be an interesting question for NASA. Certainly, you know, the outer limits of our atmosphere have life. Whether that is actually a point where we can really measure the end of our atmosphere, that might be maybe the point upon which we don't find life again. And the charts showed 2 mass extinctions. There's been 5 mass extinctions. We're in the 6th extinction. One was the meteor into the Caribbean Sea. What was the other? So the other ones are all brought about by changes in the climate. So an ice age, you know, just the Earth. Another thing about Earth science is that there are these cycles that occur. You guys might have seen kind of a scarifying article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about California is going to get another fantastically huge flood that's going to really hurt all of these cities in California. And remember this flood that happened in the 1800s in Sacramento, and it's part of a cycle that happens, you know, every X years. Well, there are cycles in the atmosphere and in the hydrosphere that do occur over incredibly different time periods. So we have El Nino and El Nina. You know, these are ocean current cycles that bring different weather that occur every year or every couple of years. But there are similar kinds of cycles that occur over hundreds of years. So it's there's a lot of complexity to what has brought about those other extinctions. Well, I will put a bunch of follow-up material, give to the folks at the Fromm in case you want to read more about any of the kinds of topics that I brought up today. You know, you can have a look at that syllabus. And I'll make one more note upon this suggested texts. I suggested 3 books. One is The Big Ratchet: How Humanity Thrives in the Face of Natural Crisis by Ruth DeFries. She's an environmental historian at Columbia University. This is a very good book. It's really not about how humanity survives. It's real. I think the publisher probably put that subtitle on it. It's really about the Great Acceleration and what has happened since the 1950s that has vastly increased humanity's impacts on the Earth. The next book, The Great Acceleration: An Environmental History of the Anthropocene Since 1945, covers the same topic. And John McNeil is also a historian at Columbia, and he is kind of credited with being the historian to bring what was happening, you know, historically in the industrialization into the scientific world, and to also make the historians aware that, you know, what's happening in science and in industry is having a gigantic impact on human history. I would choose The Big Ratchet to read over the other one. If you are the kind of person who likes to read more than one book on a topic, then read them both. But The Big Ratchet is, I think, a bit better written, and the Great Acceleration is a little repetitive. There's 2 authors on it. Sometimes that's a little hard to have a really clean narrative with 2 writers. And then I suggested this very short book, Anthropocene, a very short introduction. That's a tiny little book. It's about 100 pages, but only that big. Earl Ellis is someone who we will revisit during this term. He's very, very active in the Anthropocene community. He's an environmental, he's an ecologist and a biologist. He's from the geology, anthropology realm. And he did a really good job in this little book of synopsizing what is meant in the world of geology by this term, the Anthropocene. And I highly recommend that.
All right, sounds good. So we will get the supplemental readings to you later today or early tomorrow morning. We'll do it again, as Dawa did earlier, via email. Professor Haniball, thank you for your first lecture. It was fantastic. I was riveted. And we will see you all here next week. Take care.
Okay, looking forward to it.